Planet X, written by Evangeline Anderson, narrated by Dave Martin. Chapter 1.
No, Chrissa, come away at once.
But who is he? What is he? Chrissa Eliasson stared with fascination at the huge blindfolded man who was chained in the metal-lined hold of the Star Princess. He was the biggest man she had ever seen, and it wasn't just that he was tall, which was obvious even though he was sitting on a narrow metal bench. He was massive as well. The prisoner had a broad chest and thick arms roped with muscle that led down to a narrow waist and powerful thighs spread wide in a lazy slouch. Spiky bluish-black hair was buzzed close to his scalp, and his skin was a dusky exotic tan that Chrissa had never seen before. Everyone on her home planet was quite pale, owing to the configuration of their sun. There was a coiled tension in his muscular form that reminded her of a wild animal in repose.
Chrissa, come away!
But what's he doing here, Percy? Chrissa turned to the small, nervous man behind her, one delicate eyebrow arched in question. The Star Princess was a light-tonnage merchant-class cruise ship that carried an equal amount of cargo and passengers, but Chrissa couldn't remember anything in the glossy hollow brochure about it doubling as a prison transport.
That's none of your concern, my dear. Now, if you've got your luggage settled, then we need to go back to the blast couches and prepare for liftoff.
Percy gave her the small, tight grimace that passed for his frown. Percy de Campo was her chaperone, sent to accompany her from her home planet of Capellia to Linux Prime. Chrissa had never met a more nervous and prissy person, despite the fact that a genetic variation in the Capellian population ensured that 2/3 of its inhabitants were female. Ignoring her chaperone's orders, Chrissa took a step closer to the bound and blindfolded man. She was supposed to be stowing her pale pink carry-all cube in the hold and preparing for liftoff, but she couldn't take her eyes off the massive figure chained to the dull silver wall of the hold. There was something fascinating about him, a masculinity so intense it was nearly primal. She patted the thick roll of hair at the back of her neck nervously, making sure all her chocolate-brown curls were securely in place, though the prisoner couldn't possibly see her through the thick black blindfold he wore.
Chrissa!
Percy said, in that high nasal voice she found so annoying. Chrissa glanced over her shoulder and saw that he was standing well back from the bound man, fiddling with his monogrammed luggage nervously. Just a moment. She took another step, moving around a mountain of luggage that had been strapped down securely for liftoff. Her long sateen skirts rustled across the metal floor plates with a sound like the uneasy whispering of ghosts. Chrissa had been hoping for a little adventure on her first and only interstellar trip, but she'd never imagined it would start the minute she set foot aboard the ship. It was her first trip off planet and very likely her last. She was going to meet Lord Radisson, her future husband, who was the planetary envoy to Linux Prime. Soon her only function would be to serve as a dutiful wife and hostess to one of the wealthiest men in the galaxy, and there would be no call for any further adventures in space, which was why Chrissa was determined to make the most of this one, no matter what Percy said. She took another step, and the prisoner raised his head, his nostrils flaring in her direction, almost as though he was scenting me. The thought made Chrissa shiver even as she studied the man's face. He had a full, red, cruel-looking mouth, and his jaw was covered with dark stubble. Plain black trousers molded to his powerfully built legs, and the black tank shirt he wore left his muscular arms and shoulders bare. She wondered if he wouldn't get cold in the metal-lined hold. "Hello?" she said hesitantly. She was close enough now that she could smell a warm, musky scent coming from the chained man. It had a wild tang that, like his appearance, was utterly masculine. Somehow that scent seemed to invade all her senses at once, making her feel restless in a way she couldn't understand. His nostrils flared as he turned his head, as though tracking her somehow. Chrissa suddenly felt breathless. She tugged at the high, confining collar of her dress, wondering why it suddenly seemed so warm in the previously chilly hold.
"I wouldn't do that if I were you. He'd as soon bite you as pass a civil word."
Chrissa gave a little scream and jumped back, putting a hand between her breasts to still her rapidly pounding heart. The tight cincher she wore beneath her clothes to give her a perfect hourglass shape pinched her sharply at the sudden motion, and she stumbled, falling into the chained prisoner's lap. Reaching out blindly, she caught herself on one rock-hard thigh, feeling the blindfolded man's muscles tense immediately beneath her palm. Chrissa got a brief, blurred impression of immense strength, barely held in check by his bonds, and heard Percy shout a belated warning somewhere behind her. A low growl was building in the prisoner's corded throat, but before he could say anything to her, she was yanked backwards and away from him.
"Here, that won't do at all."
The man who had spoken to her was giving her a look that was half concerned and half reproving.
"You're lucky he didn't take off your face."
He wore a short maroon jacket trimmed with gold braid and narrow black pants that ended in shiny black boots. Chrissa recognized the uniform of the Royal Space Corps at once. The man who was speaking certainly wore it well, but despite the broad shoulders which filled out the braided jacket admirably, and his thick head of blonde hair that gleamed in the dim overhead glows of the hold, Chrissa's eyes kept returning to the chained man. She wondered what he might have said to her if the officer hadn't pulled her away. Indeed, she barely registered the fact that the man who had spoken was still holding her arm, but the inappropriate contact was certainly not lost on her chaperone.
"I'm sorry, and you are—"
Percy, who had been cowering in the corner of the hold, now stepped forward, bristling at the stranger's audacity.
"Be so kind as to unhand the future Lady Radisson,"
he added, drawing himself up to his full height of 5'4" and looking the newcomer squarely in his delightfully cleft chin.
"Terribly sorry. So rude of me. But I was concerned for the lady's safety."
He released his hold on her forearm and stepped back a pace.
"Allow me to introduce myself. Captain Owen Ketchum, at your service."
He sketched a charming little salute and actually bowed over her hand when Chrissa held it out to him. She caught a whiff of expensive Tazenberry cologne and wondered where his accent was from. New Britain, maybe? "I'm Chrissa Eliasson of Capellia, and this is Percy de Campeau, my chaperone. We're going to Linux Prime," Chrissa answered before Percy could stop her. "Where are you headed, Captain Ketchum?"
"Making my way back to Linux Omega to deliver that brute."
He jerked his chin at the chained man, who sat silently on the narrow metal bench.
"Kurt Teague. He's a feral from Alora. He's already escaped once, which is no mean feat when you consider the Linux Omega Correctional Facilities a XXX maximum security prison."
He shook his head grimly.
"This time, as you can see, we're taking no chances. Those magnolocks are rated for over 10,000 psi each."
He gave her a condescending little smile. "That's quite a lot, in case you're wondering, Miss Eliasson." No chances indeed, Chrissa thought, as she returned her attention to the silent, blindfolded prisoner. Both of his muscular forearms were indeed encased in the unbreakable magnolocks, which were attached to chains affixed firmly to the walls on either side, forcing his upper body into a very uncomfortable-looking spread-eagle position. The thick titanium steel manacles certainly looked strong enough to hold anyone in place, but remembering her earlier impression of his immense strength, Chrissa wondered if looks might not be deceiving in this case. As she watched, the prisoner tilted his head back and bared white teeth in a frightening grin, just as though he knew she was staring at him. But that wasn't possible, was it? Chrissa shuddered and looked away quickly, squeezing the hand that had touched Teague's muscled thigh tightly into a fist at her side. To think she had come so close to such a dangerous man. It gave her a curious little thrill along the length of her spine, even though she knew her interest in the huge prisoner was decidedly unladylike. "What did he do?" she asked the captain in a low voice, ignoring Percy's obvious wish to be away from the hold of the ship and the blindfolded man chained to the wall.
Oh, he's a murderer many times over. Favors the knife for his dirty work. A regular sociopathic killing machine. Aren't you, Teague?
Captain Ketchum turned his head to direct his last words to the prisoner himself, but Teague's only answer was that wild white grin again. Chrissa thought his teeth looked much sharper than normal, almost animalistic. She wouldn't have been surprised to see a smile like that staring back at her from behind the bars at the large predator exhibit at Capellia's Imperial Menagerie.
He seems to enjoy killing,
Ketchum went on with grim good humor.
But then what can you expect from a brute like that? More animal than man, these ferals.
I'm surprised he's on a merchant-class ship with normal people if he's as dangerous as you say,
Percy said nervously. He had evidently decided to resign himself to being acquainted with Captain Ketchum.
Oh, he's dangerous, all right. Deadly as they come. But you needn't worry, Mr. de Campo, Miss Eliasson.
He nodded, and a grim look passed briefly over his handsome, regular features.
I had a job to catch him, I can tell you. But now he's going back to where he belongs, the deep freeze. That's what the chaps who live there call the Linux Omega Correctional Facility, he explained. Because the temperature never gets much above 0, you know.
But why the blindfold? Chrissa couldn't help asking. Her eyes were drawn again to the silently snarling Teague.
The blindfold is actually a kindness, Ketchum replied. Ferals are indigenous to the night side of Allura. They never see the sun, so the brutes have adapted to do without it. Light is painful to their underdeveloped eyes. If I wished to be cruel, I should transport him without it, but I've never seen the need for unnecessary brutality, even to an animal like Teague.
He grinned charmingly at Chrissa, who returned the smile hesitantly. But what about... She was cut off by an announcement from the ship's overhead system. Would all passengers please report to the blast couches? Liftoff is scheduled in 10 minutes.
Well,
Percy twittered with obvious relief.
I expect we ought to be going.
Quite right,
Captain Ketchum agreed.
I shouldn't like to try a lift-off if I wasn't safely tucked in. Fairly painful, I should think.
He offered Chrissa his arm. She noticed a modest row of medals on his maroon jacket, which gleamed with muted brilliance in the dim light of the overhead glows.
May I escort you to the blast compartment?
He gravely inquired. All right. She took his arm, ignoring Percy's grumbling. But... She looked back at the chained man. But what about him? Ketchum laughed, a delightfully mellow tenor sound that fell pleasantly on her ears.
Don't worry about Teague, my dear. Ferals are extraordinarily tough. He'll be just fine without a blast couch. Unless you want me to unchain him and let him have the couch next to yours.
The pleasant tone was lightly mocking. Chrissa looked at the enormous man and felt that cool tingle of interest run along the length of her spine again. For some reason, her cheeks grew hot, and she forced herself to look away from Teague quickly. No, she said in a voice that was little more than a whisper.
I didn't think so. Let's go, shall we?
He turned them toward the metal frame of the doorway, and they left the hold with a fuming Percy in tow. Still, Chrissa couldn't resist one last look over her shoulder at the hulking figure chained to the wall of the hold. As she looked, Teague raised his head and turned his face toward her, just as though he was looking back. The last thing she saw as they exited the hold was that white, predatory grin.